First point, remember the 5 loaves. Let's start from verse 14. It says, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for the 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Now, their response is very somehow. None of them paused to ask themselves, first of all, do we eat the Pharisees' bread normally? Second, even if we used to eat the Pharisees' bread, with the way they are opposing Jesus, will it be wise for us to continue eating their bread? The funny thing is that Jesus does not even say, beware of the bread of the Pharisees. He said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Why would they think he was talking about literal bread? Were the Pharisees bakers? It's almost as if the disciples are not even trying to understand Jesus. It's almost as if their attitude is essentially, whether Jonah swallow fish or fish swallow Jonah, as long as there's a swallow, no wahala. And Jesus does not find this funny at all. See how he replies. He says, why are you talking about having no bread? Verse 17. Do you not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? And we can all empathize with Jesus because we know people like the disciples. People that it seems as if they are placed in this world to test our patience. We cannot empathize because we all know, like my former boss used to say, that it's hard to soar like an eagle when you're rolling with a bunch of turkeys. But the thing is that in this story, we are not like Jesus. We're actually like the disciples. It's us that are the turkeys. And so we must ask ourselves, why do they respond in this way? We cannot assume that the disciples are stupid because we struggle as well. And we don't think that we are stupid. So the question is this, why did they give this particular response to Jesus? Now I'll tell you why. The disciples were actually worried about not having bread. You see, the wrong response of the disciples was not because they had an intellectual problem. They answered him wrongly because they had a faith problem. In fact, if you look at the parallel account in Matthew chapter 16, in verse 8, before Jesus responds to them, the first thing he says is, "O you of little faith." And so the issue is that because the disciples had not learned to trust God, they became so consumed with their situation that it began to affect how they saw everything else. Because they were making much ado about forgetting to bring bread, they could not understand that Jesus was talking about something else entirely. And so we come to the first reason that Jesus gives about trusting God. And we see it in verse 19. It says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And he answered, 12. And if this sounds familiar, it's because we talked about it last week. Why is it coming up again? It's because just like in maths, if we have gaps, unless we address those gaps, we'll continue to struggle with the same issue over and over. But notice, Jesus does not deny the reality of their situation. He only says, why are you so quick to forget how God has come through for you before? And this is the first step to trusting God, remembering the 5 loaves that God has multiplied in your lives. And we see this call to remember all over the scriptures. The Bible tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 7 that God gave the Israelites a victory over the Philistines. And what does Samuel do? The Bible says he set up a stone and called it Ebenezer. Ebenezer means stone of help. And he said, thus far has the Lord helped us. Why did Samuel give them a physical reminder of God's faithfulness? It's because the people of God, then and now, are prone to forget. The point of the Ebenezer stone was so that every single time the people of Israel passed there, this year, next year, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, they will look at that stone and remember what God did for them in the past, and it will lead them to trust Him for the future. And I want to ask us to cast our minds back and think of the 5 loaves that God has multiplied in your lives. What do I mean? I'm talking about the things in your life that the only explanation is if it had not been for the Lord on my side. And when I say remember, I don't mean just remember in a casual way, because if you look at the account of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6, it doesn't talk about it casually. It takes the time to explain the situation that the disciples found themselves. In verse 35, it tells us that it was in a remote place and that it was late in the day. Verse 37, that even half a year's salary was not enough to feed the people. Verse 38, they set, and the only food they could find was even less than enough. But somehow, Jesus came through in an unexpected way, and everybody was full, and they even had leftovers. Here's my point. Sometimes we do not really appreciate God's goodness because we do not pause to think about how bad our situation was before. We tend to belittle God's work in our lives because we have forgotten the depth of our distress. Many times we are not trusting God for the future because we are not thinking deeply enough about our past. And I want to ask us again, what are the 5 loaves that God has multiplied in your life? Maybe sin held you in a chokehold and you were about to give up, but somehow God brought you out. Maybe your only prayer point was to be able to afford one AC. But now you're an employer of labor. Maybe the doctors gave you a contrary report, but mercy said no. But here's my point. Think about how God has delivered you. But don't stop there. Take that memory and turn it into an Ebenezer. Look at it and say, this is how God has kept me. Hitherto has the Lord helped us. Oh, but I cannot put a stone on the road like Samuel. Here's something you can do. It's called testimony. Because you see, the stone was not just for the people that fought the battle alone. It was for everybody that passed that road to see and know that God was faithful. When we remember God's faithfulness, our faith is increased. But when we testify, our faith is increased. When we testify, other people can draw on our experience and say that this God is faithful and can be trusted.